Shalom family, and welcome to Into All Truth. Welcome back. I give all praise and glory and honor to the Most High Yahshua. I pray that this word blesses the hearers. I pray that the eyes of your understanding be enlightened, that you be given a spirit of wisdom, revelation, and knowledge to know what is the hope of your calling, what is the inheritance of the assembly in Israel, and what are the riches of Yah's glory in Yeshua HaMashiach. Shalom family, so welcome to Into All Truth again. This is part 2 of my he-goats before the flock. I wanted to continue this video by giving the precept for he-goats before the flock. But the bulk of this video is going to be about the masculinization of Black women and the emasculation of Black men through Willie Lynch, Jim Crow, and the sexual oppression and confusion of Black men and women. So Jeremiah 50 verse 8 says, "Remove out of the midst of Babylon and go forth out of the land of the Chaldeans and be as he-goats before the flocks." So we see all the he-goats up here. So this is the scripture that we're referring to when we're talking about leaving the land of the Chaldeans, leaving the land of the Amorites and the Canaanites, and coming back into the promised land. Where it says, "You shall come out as he-goats as before the flock," the word for all of that, shall come out as he-goats, it's you'll come out with attitude. Basically, it's like you're going to come out with attitude. You're going to come out with the attitude of a ram or a he-goat before the flock, fully grown, as leaders of the people, chief ones, goats, rams. And the other interpretation is prompt and ready for fighting, a horse ready for the course. So this doesn't mean that they are actually going to be fighting. There is a necessity of defense, but that comes through prayer, and of course through the natural defense that Israel is able to take. But the defense, the defender, the strong defender will be Yahshua, and will be the prayers and gifts of the saints that come in this vindication of Israel. It is so strange, so that when they do enter into the promised land and there is the giant war with Gog and Magog, they are prompt and ready for the fight. But here is another precept for the he-goat or the he-ram going before the flock. And this is for a type of Yeshua going before us, again as the right-hand deliverer, but also as Yeshua, also for the men of Israel who represent the ram. So once Jacob is coming out of the land of Laban after his indentured servitude to Laban, or his essential captivity of himself and his wives and all of his property, and he's had his wages changed 10 times, he finally is released by Yah to return home to the promised land. And what he does in Genesis 33 is, first, he sends his family ahead of him, and then goes back and has this encounter with the angel of Yah. So just as Israel has been wrestling with Yah, Yah has walked contrary to Israel, but Israel first walked contrary to Yah. So Jacob wrestled with the angel and overcame him, and then was given the name Israel. So now he was named worthy to come into the promised land and to be the father of the seed of Israel. And he then crosses over the waters. He crosses through the waters. And what he also does is, when he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men in Genesis 33, he divides. It says, "Then Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and his 2 servant wives. He put the servant wives and their children at the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last." Notice how Benjamin is not born yet. Then Jacob went on ahead. And there's a misconception that he actually went behind them, but he went ahead as a he-goat. And he approached his brother and bowed to the ground 7 times before him. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they both wept. So, and then, there's, if you read, there's all this, Esau says, to stay with him, and he won't. He doesn't feel safe or comfortable. He doesn't kind of trust Yah enough. But the point of all of this is that Jacob, as Israel, guards the sheep. Esau does not oppose him. Jacob then goes on with his sons after this to win the land of Israel from the 7 nations. And because of all of the, circumcision and the murder of the 7 nations, which I went into in part 1, Jacob then goes with Israel to the land where he was originally supposed to go to, that he was afraid to go to with Esau, and he settles down there, and he is now settled in the promised land. And finally, Rachel is able to now give birth to Benjamin. And Benjamin is, in a sense, like Israel, or the son who is going to be born now out of captivity. Because this is the 12th son, the final son who is born. This is the last birth, okay, of the sons of Israel. And Benjamin's name is pronounced Benyamin. And when we look at it, it's Bayat Nun, Yod, Mem, Yod, Nun. So it's basically like the house, Israel's house, the son of Israel's house, the seed delivered by the right hand of Yah, by the Mashiach, out of blood and chaos. Delivered by the right hand of Yah, or Yahshua, the seed. Okay? So it's the right hand, seed of man, son of Yah. So this is the birth of a new priest, the firstborn son and the lastborn son. So this is the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So the other significant aspect of Benjamin is that obviously Rachel is often called Israel, Rachel weeping for her children. Rachel gives birth to the last son. And of course, Israel is finally reborn in Mashiach, the final coming, the final return of the son of the seed. Okay? Benjamin in Strong's Concordance here is defined as son of the right hand, aka son of the delivering hand of Yah, son of Yeshua, son of salvation. One of the things I think is really important that we discuss in this is we know a little bit about how men have been emasculated within the culture of captivity, but we don't often discuss how Hebrew Israelite women were masculinized. So what I want to do is talk about that and talk about how the trauma of breaking the people of the transatlantic slave trade has ended up in this sort of twisted identity and conception of self, as well as male and female roles. And I've been wanting to do a video on Willie Lynch and the effects of Jim Crow and the transatlantic slave trade on the breaking of people for a very long time. So I'm just going to refer to it a little bit, but what I really want to focus on is how the white male notions and female notions of patriarchy, or male and female relationships, were transferred onto the Hebrews in a way that is contrary to Scripture. Physical and sexual attacks against men and women through heterosexual rape and homosexual rape, and all of those things have confused the known identity of the people. And of course, people have still come out strong, but there are things that we have to acknowledge so that we can go forwards to understand what the true roles of Hebrew Israelite men and women are. And Iskar actually did a really good video on this, on the roles of Adam and Eve before the fall. So their roles in the garden. I'm also going to refer to this book, I'm going to refer to Sojourner Truth's speech called Ain't I a Woman, so that we can learn how Hebrew Israelite women were masculinized. I'm also going to refer to a book by Bell Hooks called Ain't I a Woman, which really documents a lot of this and documents how the strength of Black women became, and the balanced relationship that came out of being Hebrew people became perceived within a white patriarchal society as non-feminine. Okay? So how the role of women was, of the Hebrew women, was twisted into being non-feminine or non-woman because of the values of the dominant culture. And then how the values of how to control or how to relate to your woman were imposed on the Hebrew men. And I am not a feminist. This book, Ain't I a Woman, is called Black Women and Feminism because she really challenges feminist views on, white feminist views on the roles of Black women. And she's not a lesbian. But I don't agree with a lot of her views because she's not coming from a Hebraic perspective. But she does bring a lot of history to the table of relations between Black men and women pre-captivity to Babylon, America, and then throughout that captivity and into the 60s, and our changing perceptions of one another. And I think this is really important because my feeling is that the people of Israel have undergone a great deal of trauma. And especially the men, with being imprisoned, still being sodomized and raped in prison, that being part of the whole gang culture. And a lot of people waking up, especially these camps, can be coming out of that kind of thing. I just know average people from professional families, and most of the guys I grew up with wound up in prison, even though their parents are doctors and lawyers and everything, because that's how the culture is. So then the men become subjected to their emasculation through sodomy and rape and a culture imposing homosexuality on them. And the same thing with women. And also there's just a period within the culture where people began to devour one another also. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the idea of Hebrew men and women setting themselves apart and focusing on Yah as they come out of the captivity. I think there's too much of an emphasis on Hebrew men procreating, getting married, having lots of wives. If you're dealing with men and women who've been through sexual and social trauma, that's going to be very difficult. There's a lot of people who just do it well and do it with such great love and who've come out of foster care systems. I have friends who have come out of foster care systems. They're amazing parents. So it's not going to affect everybody adversely, but nonetheless, I think that it's interesting. I'm going to just briefly go over Jubilee's version of Adam and Eve in the garden and a little bit of Genesis, Adam and Eve in the garden. And I just want to talk about the roles of men and women as defined by Yah at that time. First, I'm going to do Sojourner Truth's speech, but I want to return to the original roles of men and women as defined by Yah, and then compare that to how they were degraded or perverted through captivity, self-captivity, and through the whole slavery process. And then to review some of the history of that and how it changed our concept of ourselves. Because once again, I don't think it's necessary for people to be getting married and having children and procreating right now. I think that And what you'll notice is that before Adam and Eve in Jubilees, it talks about before they entered the garden, they were purified. They were born, they took a week off, and then they had their days of purification before they actually entered the garden. And as Israel is coming out of the land of captivity, out of their blood and water, and being reborn into the promised land, into the garden, into Israel, this is why we have the Feast of Trumpets, the time of atonement, the time of purification. And so I think focusing on those things, looking after existing relationships, but focusing on the purification of the people and their relationship to Yah more so than marrying and procreation and all of that kind of stuff is far more important. And I think people setting themselves apart and being healed by Yah and letting Yah heal them so that they're in great relationship with Yah before they can explore any of those things is probably the best thing for anybody to do right now. There is a well-known speech by Sojourner Truth called Ain't I a Woman from the 1700s. Okay, it was supposed to be delivered around 17 to 1800 within a 100-year span at a women's convention in Akron, Ohio. And this is what she had to say. Well, children, there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. So what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? The audience whispers, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where does your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. So here is the first example of an explanation of how the Hebrew women were masculinized as men. She plowed, she planted, her arm was as strong as a man, she could eat as much as a man, and she had to bear as much of the lash as a man. So what do we know about the history of how the women of Israel were treated during and before slavery? Well, I'm sad to say, brothers and sisters, that Israel enslaved themselves, women first. An observation by Amanda Berry Smith, a 19th century Black woman missionary who visited African communities and reported on the condition of African women. So this is our own sisters' reports on their sisters in Africa, okay? What Bell Hooks has to say in this book is that white male observers of African culture in the 18th and 19th centuries were astounded and impressed by the African male's subjugation of the African female. And this included polygamy. So not only this level of abuse, but there's also polygamy happening. They were not accustomed to a patriarchal social order that demanded not only that women accept their inferior status, but that they participate actively in the community labor force. Okay? So, in other words, quote, Gentile men were not accustomed to women doing men's labor. And they had been Christianized and were now reading the scripture. So when they saw this, they were amazed. And so here's Amanda Berry Smith's report on the state and the condition of African women. The poor women of Africa, like those of India, have a hard time. As a rule, they have all the hard work to do. They have to cut and carry all the wood, carry all the water on their heads, and plant all the rice. The men and boys cut and burn the bush with the help of women. But sowing the rice, planting the cassava, the women have to do. You will often see a great big man walking ahead with nothing in his hand but a cutlass, as they always carry that, or a spear. So this is for defense. And a woman, his wife, coming on behind with a great big child on her back and a load on her head. No matter how tired she is, her Lord would not think of bringing her a jar of water to cook his supper with, or of beating the rice. No, she must do that. So we see here that the white male observers of this clearly saw they could enslave a people from this, observing these facts. So this is why the scripture talks about the Gentiles forwarding the affliction. They just basically easily spun the wheel in the direction it was already rolling in and forwarded the affliction. They saw the masculinization of the women of Israel by their own men. Israel enslaves themselves first. When we look at this, the women, what are they doing? They are planting the cassava, sowing the seed, and chopping wood. Now, when we look at the history of women in Africa, perceptively, we see that the men, contrary to the law, multiplied wives. Now, this is in a culture of enslavement imposed on the West. So these men are defending their wives. However, they are not sharing the duties with their wives. And in addition to that, they're still multiplying wives. So you can imagine the Gentiles now have the book, and they know that neither a king nor a priest should multiply wives. And they also know that men, they know the curse that was put upon Adam. And what was that curse? Well, in Genesis 3:17, unto Adam Yah said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree thereof, of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. So sorrow is, it's sawbone. And so it's in worrisomeness, in labor and pain, toil, hardship, shall thou eat of it. So ironically here, though, now this was really probably a curse on both of them, but since Adam was the primary protector of the garden and tiller of the garden, this was the curse Yah gave to him. And so why is he not working it off in this picture? Well, obviously, because of the slave trade, the men are protecting themselves and their women. But at the same time, there is no sharing in the work. And when we look at Genesis, we look at Jubilees in particular, we see that Adam and Eve did actually share their work. And there is no error in the women working this hard. It's just that the man is not doing his work and he's not sharing in the work. And this is the sin that obviously the Europeans saw. These men had already enslaved their women and were lording authority over them. So Adam was first placed in the Garden of Eden to till and guard it. Why guard it? Because when Yah created the earth, there was chaos and the fallen were already there. So he had to create a land for his new creation, his new man, to have dominion over, to protect and guard the Garden of Eden, the garden of life and purity. And this is why Yah instructs both Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth. And so when we read this, it says that in Jubilees 3 verse 17, that he tilled the garden, it was naked and knew it not, and was not ashamed. He protected the garden from the birds and the beasts and the cattle, and gathered not and was not ashamed. And he protected the garden from the birds and the beasts and the cattle, and gathered its fruit and ate, and put aside the residue for himself and for his wife. So you see, he's providing food for his wife. She's helping him, but he is the guarder of the garden and the one who puts away and provides food for his wife. Okay? But both of them are protecting and tilling, but that is the order. He is the first protector. He is the first to till, as in the order of Yah. And so he does what Yah commands him to do, and then his other self, his womb man, she follows him. So when we look at this scripture, and I'm not going to go too much into detail, Issachar does really good teaching on it, but when we look at the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, they are both sharing work, although he is the primary protector, okay? And he does not have dominion over her. They are both given dominion over the earth. And he is given, before Eve is removed from his side, he is given the task of naming all of the animals. He doesn't name Eve because he doesn't have dominion over her, Eve or Hawa. He does not have dominion over her, so he does not name her. Okay? But, so he calls her bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, womb man. She has come out of me, she's me with a womb. So he doesn't name her. And when Adam is accused of his sin and told of the consequences that he will reap because of eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then it is at this point that he blames Yah for giving him the woman. And she is distanced and separated from him at that point. And the only authority she has to go to is the one who beguiled her, Ha-Satan, right? And when they are cast out of the garden, now he names her, calling her Hawa. So him having dominion over her is a consequence of the fall, is a consequence of sin. And so when Eve is given her curse by Yah, she is told that, in pain you will deliver your children. In pain you'll have in childbirth you'll have pain, and your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And this is the consequence of her usurping his authority and taking rulership over him. So, at this point, it is very clear when you read through Jubilees, and I really encourage you guys to read it yourself, but what we come to understand from it is that they had equal dominion, equal power. She helped him, he helped her. And in fact, when they do start having children outside of the garden, he actually raises the children too. Okay, he instructs Cain and Abel. And so one thing I want to say here is Bell Hooks makes some interesting observations in her book. It's a very long book, but one of the things she says is that European men did not seem to like their women. He did not share his power with her, even in enslaving the Hebrews. He dominated her and caused her to depend on the woman, the Hebrew woman, for her power for the setting up of her home. And he also depended on the power and energy and submission of Hebrew men and women to his patriarchal power. And this is patriarchy. It's about subjugation and submission. And I don't want you guys to get all confused and thinking that I'm saying that, patriarchy is wrong according to the Hebrew Bible. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the white male concept of patriarchy was wrong. And that white men, even today, have difficulty sharing their power with their women, which is why their women are taking everything over now. But a culture that is based upon slavery, the enslavement and stealing of others, is going to be based on subjugation. And so its concept of patriarchy and male and female relationships must, by extension, be based on subjugation. So the white man subjugates the white woman, and both of them subjugate or oppress black people, and that's how their kingdom is built, on oppression. So this was a perfect opportunity for the Europeans, obviously, to take advantage of this broken relationship, this relationship of dominance and subjugation that had taken place between Hebrew men and women at this point. And so this is what the European men saw and thought when they saw this. They said, African women schooled in the art of obedience to a higher authority by the tradition of her society was probably seen by the white male slaver as an ideal subject for slavery. Much of the work to be done in the American colonies was in the area of agriculture. It undoubtedly occurred to slavers that the African female, accustomed to performing arduous work in the fields, also while performing a wide variety of tasks in the domestic household, would be very useful on the American plantation. While only a few African women were aboard the first slave ships bringing slaves to the New World, as the slave trade gathered momentum, females made up 1/3 of the human cargo aboard most ships, because they could not effectively resist and capture at the hands of the thieves and kidnappers. African women became frequent targets for white male slavers. Slavers also used the capture of women important to the tribe, like the daughter of a king, as a means of luring African men into situations where they could be easily captured. Other African women were sold into slavery as punishment for breaking tribal laws. A woman found guilty of committing an act of adultery might be sold into bondage. So here we see an effort of the African men to protect their women when they're held hostage, but we also see the selling of women who were disobedient to the law as a punishment. So that's kind of a betrayal of the people, generally because we know that there was a lot of polygamy among these tribes and still is today, which is against the law. So now we know what was going on in West Africa before the transatlantic slave trade started. And of course, we know there's a whole history of the Moors and the fall of the temple before that, and the bringing of the people to West Africa and the scattering and dividing, all of that sort of thing. But we do have an indicator of the state that the Hebrews were in once they were in West Africa. And so I want to talk about the treatment of women and men on the slave ships. Now, we know a lot about their treatment, but in addition, I just want to go into some of the basics because it's important to understand how women were masculinized again and how women were made to suffer during the slave trade. So generally the men on this particular slave ship were shackled and isolated from the women on the slave ships and kept below. And women roamed on some ships. So she and her children were subject to the attack of their slavers, and the men could do nothing. Now here's a description of the type of thing which is horrific that some women, or a particular woman in this case, had to endure. Black women with children on board the slave ships were ridiculed, mocked, and treated contemptuously by the slave crew. Often the slavers brutalized the children to watch the anguish of their mothers. In their personal account of life aboard a slave ship, the Weldons recounted an incident in which a child of 9 months was flogged continuously for refusing to eat. 9-month-old baby. When the beating failed to force the child to eat, the captain ordered the child to be placed feet first into a pot of boiling water. After trying other torturous methods with no success, the captain dropped the child and caused its death. Not deriving enough satisfaction from this sadistic act, he then commanded the mother to throw the body of the child overboard. The mother refused, but was beaten until she submitted. The traumatic experiences of African women and men aboard slave ships were only the initial stages of the indoctrination process that would transform the African free human being into a slave. Okay, and so this is again an account of a Hebrew woman's treatment on slave ships. Many African women were pregnant prior to their capture or purchase, and they were forced to endure pregnancy without care given to their diet, without any exercise, and without any assistance during labor. In their own communities, African women had been accustomed to much pampering and care during pregnancy, so the barbaric nature of childbearing on the slave ship was both physically harmful and psychologically demoralizing. Annals of history record that the American slave ship Congress carried 250 women, many of them pregnant, who were squeezed into a compartment of 16 by 18 feet. The white slaver could exercise freely absolute power over the female slaves, where he could brutalize and exploit her without fear of harmful retaliation. Black female slaves moving freely about the decks were a ready target for any white male who might choose to physically abuse and torment them. Initially, every slave on board ship was branded with a hot iron. A cat of 9 tails was used by the slavers to lash those Africans that cried out in pain or resisted the torture. Women were lashed severely for crying. They were stripped of their clothing and beaten on all parts of their body. Ruth and Jacob Weldon, an African couple who experienced the horrors of the slave passage, saw mothers with babies at their breasts, basely branded and scarred till it would seem as if the very heavens might smite the eternal tormentors with the doom they so richly merited. After the branding, all slaves were stripped of any clothing. The nakedness of the African female served as a constant reminder to her sexual vulnerability. Rape was a common method of torture slavers used to subdue recalcitrant black women. The threat of rape or other physical brutalization inspired terror in the psyches of displaced African females. Robert Schufelt, an observer of the slave trade, interesting name, asserts in those days many a Negroes was landed upon our shore already impregnated by someone on the demoniac crew that brought her over. So lust was also an institutionalized method of terrorism used against Hebrew women. Now we know it was used against men as well through sodomy. Okay, so we're not going to deny that. But these same things, identical things, happen to women, okay, as happened to men. Not only that, but the women were also dealing with the hostility of white women's jealousy about their own rape and abuse at the hands of the husbands of these white women. So they were dealing with an attack from white men and white women, and sometimes from their own brothers. Whereas the brothers were dealing with the white man, and probably some attacks from their women as well, but not from such a large group as the women were. So sexual lust was an institutionalized method of terrorism which had as its goal the demoralization and the dehumanization of black women. In confronting the black woman as an adversary in a sexual contest, the master would be subjecting her to the most elemental form of terrorism distinctly suited for the female rape. Given the already terroristic texture of plantation life, it would be as a potential victim of rape that the slave woman would be most unguarded. Further, she might most conveniently manipulated if the master contrived a random system of sorts, forcing her to pay with her body for foods, diminished severity of treatment, and the safety of her child, etc. So this was a real terrorism that the women were subject to, especially in the house under the gaze of their mistress and master always. Okay? And so violence and abuse by white women was often worse or equal to that of the men. And this was not something that African men suffered, okay? White women would have Hebrew women's breasts hacked off, their faces marred or cut or lips cut off, and their children starved to death as punishment. Okay? Now, I want to recount some of the things that were done to the men because in my work, on my job, everyone is so politically correct and pro-homosexual. And twice in the last 2 weeks, I've had to listen to young white people in their 20s say, yeah, it's so hard for black men to come out of the closet and be accepted as being gay. And the culture of black people just doesn't allow it. And in both cases, I just freaked out. I just was like, I didn't freak out, but I just was like, look. I said, you have to understand that our men were broken through sodomy and still are today. They were forced, it was not of our culture to practice homosexuality, although it was after coming out of Egypt, and that's why the law had to be put down. But it was not the custom of the Hebrews to have these practices, and so rape and sodomy of men was used to humiliate and break their spirits, and it was done in front of everybody to break everyone's spirits, the most strong and masculine men. And I said, this is the reason why we hate it, because even today our young men in their tweens and teens are put in prison and raped and sodomized, and they were in the past sodomized by white men. And even today, prison guards and stuff, and I said, and then within the culture of the prisons. And that is why all the rappers and young men wear these sagging pants, because it's the same way they had to wear their pants sagging when they were on the plantations. And it is a reminder of that, and I would say that's why we hate it. And so I had to give that speech twice in 2 weeks, so or 10 days. So anyway, I did want to just give one account of this, which was actually in Brazilian history, which I found. I know there's a lot of them. I just don't want to repeat some of the ones that other people have done. And so this is from the book Slavery Unseen, Sex, Power, and Violence in Brazilian History, but we know all the same things were going on in America. And we're not only talking about America, we're talking about all of the slavery to the four corners of the earth. But here's a particularly awful story from Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself in 1861. The slave Luke was appointed to wait upon his bedridden master, whose despotic habits were greatly increased by exasperation at his own helplessness. He kept a cowhide, in other words, a whipping cowhide, beside him, and for the most trivial occurrence, he would order his attendant Luke to bare his back and kneel beside the couch while he whipped him till his strength was exhausted. Some days he was not allowed to wear anything but his shirt in order to be in readiness to be flogged as this man lay there in his bed. And it gives a ... so we don't know what's in between there. A mere degraded wreck of manhood, he took into his head the strangest freaks of despotism. And if Luke hesitated to submit to his orders, the constable was immediately sent for. Some of these freaks, and this is where the word freak comes from, freaky, crazy crap, some of these freaks were of a nature too filthy to be repeated. When I fled from the house of bondage, I left poor Luke still chained to the bedside of this cruel and disgusting wretch. So that is how black men were emasculated. But then the women were masculinized in a different way. While black men were not forced to assume a role colonial American society regarded as feminine, black women were forced to assume a masculine role. Black women labored in the fields alongside black men, but few, if any, black men labored as domestics alongside women in the white household, except for the possible exception of butlers whose status was still higher than that of the maid. Okay? So we see that there is a special kind of oppression coming down on black women. In American society, privileged white women rarely worked in the fields. Occasionally, a white female indentured servant was forced to work in the field as a punishment for misdeeds, but this was not a common practice in the eyes of colonial white Americans. Only debased and degraded members of the female sex labored in the fields, okay? So the point of this is to say that women were made to do men's work, and even though women had done what patriarchs and the white patriarchy would call men's work in the past, it caused them to be considered masculine or male, not women. So they were masculinized. Conversely, men of the transatlantic slave trade, even though they were raped and sodomized at times, were not expected to take on roles or labor that a woman would take on, such as cooking in the kitchen or nursing a baby or cleaning the house or things of that nature. Although enslaved African women had labored in the fields in African communities, these tasks were seen as an extension of a woman's feminine role. Transplanted African women soon realized that they were seen as surrogate men by their white male slavers. On any plantation with a substantial number of female slaves, black women performed the same tasks as black men. They plowed, planted, harvested crops. And on some plantations, black women worked longer hours in the fields than black men, even though it was a widespread belief among white plantation owners that black women were often better workers than their male counterparts. How they're creating these emasculating rumors that women are better workers than the men. Only a male slave could rise to the position of driver or overseer. You see that in 12 Years a Slave. And you see the woman, can't remember her name right now, but she is picking a massive amount of cotton, way more than the man. So the African man largely was allowed to maintain, even though sexually he could have been harassed or raped, he still kept the male roles, the male jobs, and resented having to perform any female tasks, okay, which is reasonable. Although both black women and men labored to pick ripe cotton, it was believed that the more delicately tapered fingers of the black female made it easier for her to gather the cotton from the pod. White overseers expected black female workers to work as well, if not better, than their male counterparts. If a black female worker failed to accomplish the amount of work expected of her, she was punished. But they did not discriminate in the area of punishment. Female slaves were beaten as harshly as male slaves. Observers of the slave experience claim that this was common on a plantation to see black females stripped naked, tied to a stake, and whipped with a hard saw or club. Same punishment given to men, given to women. When I was in my early 20s, the only place where I could get my history of our people was through reading novels of, by West Indian and some African, but primarily West Indian and African American authors. And I read Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and many, many more authors. But they really very well document the history of this oppression. And one of the things, now James Baldwin is somebody I suggest people read because he does a really interesting analysis through narrative of how this affected the black community. And one of the main stories that he writes is this book called Tell Me How Long This Train's Been Gone. And it goes into the sodomy and rape his brother experienced in prison, the predatory white men he found in his own life throughout his entire career who were always preying on him for sex, and also confusion in family relationships and incest and predatory homosexual behavior. Some of Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison's books go into what happens on the chain gangs and so forth, like into the Jim Crow era. We know that the brothers were often castrated when they were hung. There was always this ritual of castration. White women were mutilating black women sexually in the same way that white men were mutilating black men when they lynched them or hung them. And of course, as you go into the culture of psychology and anthropology in the Gentile institutions, you find that there's always this factor of saying that black women, just how it says in the scripture, your women will rule over you. It's a consequence of the sin, because through the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the people of Israel, the Gentile nations, the dominant culture, the Amorites, have always sought to classify. They go into this new era where they begin to classify black women as having now castrated the men. So, in other words, the Amorites, the Americans, and the Europeans literally castrated, sodomized, and raped our men, and then accused the Hebrew women of castrating men of their masculine identity. And so there's a lot of confusion generated. And among the families of the Hebrews, men and women were raped and abused by mothers, fathers, grandmothers, brothers, sisters. I mean, I have the most masculine, dark-skinned, good-looking brothers sit down with me and talk to me when I'm working sometimes, and they'll tell me about how they got molested when they were 3 years old and repeatedly by one of their brothers or whatever. And they're straight and they're, but it's just everybody's got a story. So I think this is why I want to analyze this history a little more about how Hebrew men and women of the slave trade were taught to hate each other and themselves and to devour one another. And this is again why I say that this is all trauma that people need to set themselves apart unto Yah for and purify themselves before entering into the garden, into the promised land, to do that time of purification, and to simply serve Yah until they are healed. Because procreation, it doesn't work well or correctly until people are healed. And I think in these camps and communities, they force these young men who've had these experiences. And I have to say, as I've said before, I grew up with people who doctors, lawyers, their parents were from the West Indies and England and everything, and their sons wind up in prison and have this crap. My brother, my friends, brothers, two-parent families, everything should be okay, but they wind up in prison and subjected to this harassment and abuse within families, all of this kind of stuff. I've talked to some of my girlfriends about it, and it's like, I was like, you never talked to me about this. And it's because everyone was in hatred of one another, right? In competition with one another, crabs in a barrel. So I think the best way to deal with this is to set yourself apart and to counsel with one another about these things, and for people to talk very openly about it. And when these attacks are made on people of the transatlantic slave trade about not being pro-homosexual friendly or anything, we have to, I've done it twice where I just raise it. I will just literally be standing in a room full of people who are talking about this kind of stuff. Oh, black people are just not open to this. Men can't come out of the closet. And I will just recite this brutality. And it shuts everyone up because there's nothing they can say against it. Like I literally said, this is why our people hate it, because our children, our men, even today, our young men are put in prison without cause and subjected to this. So it's hard to make an argument against it. I want to go back to Sojourner Truth's speech that she made, because she's entreating the white men, it seems to say that basically the black men in the South and the white women in the North, the white women are fighting for their rights, the black men are fighting for their rights. Nobody's fighting for the women's rights, which was actually true for black women. It was the daughters of the revolution, the white women, who actually made interracial marriage among white men and black women illegal, because black women were taking away white men. But there was definitely a very strong period in history when, after the plantation time and going into the 60s, 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that black men began to appeal to white women as brothers, and where black women were blamed for castrating the black male. And this is what can often happen with this scripture that says, and your women will rule over you. The false impression that is left is that Hebrew Israelite women are lording their authority over men, and they are the ones who castrated the men. But we have this very clear history of the white men castrating black men. Literally. And once black men were able to become involved sexually with white women, was the brothers started to excuse this in various ways. And they started by saying that they were exploiting white women like white men exploited black women. And and this is in, or they would evoke a false sense of avenging themselves against racism to mask their exploitative feelings about white women, and finally all women. So you see, they began to adopt a sexist attitude towards all women by learning the ways of the Gentile men. So black men began to devalue any relationships, interracial relationships between black women and white men. And it was not that I'm, trying to promote interracial relationships at the expense of relationships amongst the Hebrews. But what it did was it gave black women less options while black men were seeking out relationships with white women. Okay? So it reduced the options for black women for partners, not only among black men, but even among white men. And so this systematic devaluation of black women led to a downgrading of any activity black women did. Many black women attempted to shift focus and attention away from sexuality by emphasizing their commitment to motherhood. So black women are still being harassed by white women and white men at this point, although there's the odd option of relationship with white men. And so what happened historically was that women began to focus more on motherhood or being a cult of true womanhood. And so that went off into lesbianism and that kind of thing. But the real emphasis amongst straight black women was that their lives were rooted in family. And then they would work diligently in service jobs to provide economically for their children and demonstrate their love by their incredible self-sacrifice. And but their efforts were acknowledged by the American public. Whites deliberately cast them in a negative light. So then they were cast as the Aunt Jemimas, the Sapphires, the Amazons, all negative images based on stereotypes of womanhood. So always the mammy, always the mother. So even though caring and providing for your children in a society that won't let your men work or live with you, they were then mocked for being mothers. And so this was the onslaught, social onslaught against even being a mother and trying to provide for your family. And so this affected how we even perceived ourselves. And so then many of these anti-black women, like the woman as a family, a provider for her family and a mother and a grandmother over her family, these stereotypes actually originated in slavery, as the woman bearing many children and big mama in the house, then became big mama in her own house, but she was mocked. And so then sociologists started to come up with, perpetuate this theory of black matriarchy. Okay? And so this is when the black culture got labeled as being a matriarchal culture, where the woman was the center of the home. And of course, this conforms to the curse. Women will rule over you. Okay? And so one of the things that male slavers did to discredit the contributions of black females was the myth that they were all masculinized subhuman creatures. Black female slaves had shown that they were capable of performing so-called manly labor, and they were able to endure hardship, pain, privation, but could also perform womanly tasks of housekeeping, cooking, child-rearing. Their ability to cope effectively in a sexist-defined male role, okay, so that's male according to the dominant culture, not according to scripture, because, you know, black women, we just do what needs to get done, right? We just help. But their ability to cope effectively in a sexist-defined male role threatened patriarchal myths about the nature of women's inherent physiological difference and inferiority, forcing black female slaves to perform the same work and tasks as black male slaves. So by doing this, though, the white men are now contradicting their own sexist order that claimed women to be inferior because she lacked physical prowess. So then, in order to explain black women's ability to survive without direct aid of a male and her ability to perform tasks that were culturally defined as male work, white males then argued that black slave women were not real women, but were masculinized, some subhuman creatures. And this is because white men feared white women once they witnessed this strength in black women. So when white men saw black women surviving and supporting the family, even though the men were so pulled down, they had to use this matriarchy tactic against black women and put it into the minds of black men to make black men hate black women. So like their slave-owning ancestors, racist scholars acted as if black women fulfilling their role as mothers and economic providers were performing a unique action that needed a new definition, even though it wasn't uncommon for poor widowed white women to perform this dual role. Yet they labeled black women matriarchs. So this is when they turn us into a matriarchal society. However, no matriarchy has ever existed in the United States, because you have to be controlling the whole country for that. As it has to be a women matriarchy. At the very time sociologists proclaimed the existence of a matriarchal order in the black family structure, black women represented one of the largest socially and economically deprived groups in America, whose status in no way resembled that of a matriarch. And so Angela Davis writes, the designation of black women as a matriarch is a cruel misnomer because it ignores the profound traumas the black woman must have experienced when she had to surrender her childbearing to alien and predatory economic interests. The term matriarch implies the existence of a social order in which women exercise social and political power. So they presented black women as a state within the state, the racist patriarchal colonial state, overseeing the state of black people. But this was false. The decisions that determine the way in which black women must live their lives are made by others, usually white men. If sociologists are to casually label black women matriarchs, they should also label female children playing house and acting out the role of mothers as matriarchs. For in both instances, this power didn't really exist. They were just managing and have been managing. And Yah has blessed by faith. And so here is the strategy. This Jean Bond and Paul Perry write this matriarchy myth and send it out into the minds of black men. This article called, Is the Black Male Castrated? The casting of this image of the black female in sociological bold relief is both consistent and logical in racist terms, for the so-called black matriarch is a kind of folk character largely fashioned by whites out of half-truths and lies about the involuntary conditions of black women. So everybody knows the conditions were not perfect, and black women were not ruling their own state exclusive of the white state. It just looks that way, and it was put into the minds of black men in order to turn black men and women. Then you had the feminists routing black women, saying, oh, we're like you. We want to be independent. And they were pushing black women to say, I'm completely independent. I don't need no man. And of course, all the abuse coming out of slavery would fuel that even more. So just as white men perceived the entry of white women into the labor force as a threat to male positions, black men were socialized to regard the presence of black women in labor force with similar suspicions. And of course, women were socialized as well to believe they were matriarchs, even though they weren't necessarily thriving. The matriarchy theory gave black men a framework on which to base his condemnation of the working black woman. Many black men did not feel at all personally demasculized, absorbed the sexist ideology, and regarded wage-earning black women with contempt. These men claimed that female-headed household was a direct result of matriarchal tendencies of black women, and argued that no real man could remain in a household where he was not the sole boss. Using this sexist logic, that it was never the black female having so much power in the home that alienated some black men, but that she never had any power at all. Now, I don't totally agree with that. I do think that, though, that black men and women have been turned on one another, and men have been made to feel that females were a threat to their personal power. And so this is what they did, was they shifted the responsibility for unemployment of black men onto black women and away from themselves. So white male racist oppressors were able to establish a bond of solidarity or brotherhood, fake brotherhood with black men based on mutual sexism. So based on saying, yeah, it's your woman who's the problem. It's not me. With manumission, then generally Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman were kind of an exception to the norm. But at public appearances, rallies, luncheons, and dinners, black male leaders spoke in support of patriarchal rule. They did not talk directly about discrimination against women. Instead, they had these romantic visions of black men lifting black women up onto pedestals, which is actually not too bad for a season. It was something that black women, I think, really needed at that time. And so then they moved into this idea of distinct sex roles and patterns for black women and men specialized, just like was in the dominant white culture. So it says, let our young men and women prepare themselves for usefulness in business, that men may enter into merchandise trading and other things of importance, and young women may become teachers of various kinds and otherwise places of usefulness. Our females must be qualified because they are to be mothers of our children. As mothers are the first nurse and instructors of children. From them, children consequently get their first impression, which being always the most lasting should be more correct. Raise the mothers above the level of degradation, and the offspring is elevated with them. Now, some more of the book, page 90, goes into the black male activists like Douglas, Booker T. Washington, and so on, being against their wives helping with activism. But of course, oftentimes, obviously, black women were very strong at influence in activism historically. So there are so many black women who have forwarded the cause. And so, again, it was something imposed by the Europeans to not have this kind of equality in the garden, with the man having the last say, but not behaving with an attitude of dominion or domination over the woman. African-American Calvin Chase wrote an editorial in B titled Our Women, which he urged black men to assume the role of protector of black womanhood, and he admonished, let us do our duty by defending our women. Let us set up a system of reformation, not only of our women, but everything that pertains to the race's advancement. And so 19th century leaders like James Forten, Charles Redmond, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass supported the efforts of women to gain political rights, but they did not appear to support social equality. And of course, there's a white writer who says, Southern racists and black activists looked at women in similar terms. Both viewed the female as a second sex with distinctly limited privileges. So you can see that there was, first of all, that's creating a schism between the men and the women, and the men actually wanting to protect women by making a statement by that, a white author. But at the same time, it does show that to a certain degree the men were learning the ways of the Gentiles. But at the same time, they had come out of this terrible period of slavery and were coming into a Renaissance period. And so they were seeking to do things the best way that they could. So I think it's best to look at the good intentions, but to be on guard against this unbalanced dynamic again. The men not being able to fully access the power of their women because it's submitted to this Gentile or European concept of what male and female roles should be, which ultimately was based on slavery. So it's going to be based on oppression and dominion. And so it can never be right. When we look at the writings of Amiri Baraka, July 1970 issue of Black World, I think it's quite a beautiful effort to try to equalize things. Of course, Bell Hooks regards it as a way of establishing a black patriarchy, which when we read a little further is actually true, but the good sentiment of the original training, I think, is there, training in Yah. So he says, we talk about black women and black men like we are separate because we have been separated. Our hands reach out for each other for the closeness and completeness we are for each other, the expansion of consciousness that we provide for each other. So this is very much like the state of Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall, before Eve when Eve was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, the womb of his man, right? But after the fall, she became Eve, right? She became something he dominated that was separate from him. And then in the law, in Torah, in Mashiach, man and woman, that's why it says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman. And I think it's kind of like the difference between Adam and Eve. It's now they are now one again in Yeshua HaMashiach. So he says here, we were separated by the deed and process of slavery. We internalized the process, permitting it to create an alien geography in our skulls, a wandering spirit that had us missing each other and never understanding just what it was. After we were gone from each other, my hand might rest on yours, and still you would be gone, and I, of course, not there, out wandering among the rogues and whores of the universe. And so this separation is the cause of our need for self-consciousness and eventual healing. But we must erase the separateness by providing ourselves with healthy African identities, by embracing a value system that knows of no separation, but only of the divine complement of the black woman. The black woman is for her man. So, for instance, we do not believe in the equality of men and women. We cannot understand what the devils and the devilishly influenced mean when they say equality for women. We can never be equals. Nature has not provided thus. The brother says, let a woman be a woman, let a man be a man. So this is a honest representation of the truth, although a little bit skewed, because wives are submit to their husbands, and husbands are submit to their wives. They're to submit to one another, but the husband is the end authority, and that's why you can't have it both ways. You must understand that, and that is why Adam is blamed for the sin of the world and not Eve. And so if you say you want to be the final authority, then you must accept that. If you want to blame Eve for the sin of the world, then you must accept that you are completely equal and her authority is equal to yours, which is not scriptural. Okay? But you are equal in Yeshua HaMashiach, but still the man is a type of Christ over the church, or Mashiach over the church, or Yah over the Son. The Son does everything the Father wills him to do, but it's in agreement because they're one. It's not because one is inferior, but their roles are different. But what we finally see is that Baraka does finally cave into a white male patriarchal mindset because he abandons his black woman eventually. He writes this statement here in the book where it says, Jim Brown put it very straight, and this is really quite true. He says that there are black men and white men, and there are women. So you can indeed be going through a black militant thing and have yourself a woman. The fact that she happens to be black or white is no longer impressive to anybody. But a man who gets himself a woman is what's impressive. The battle is really between white men and black men, whether we like to admit it. That is the battlefield at this time. So sadly here, this is Baraka goes from this idealistic, almost Eden-like image that they wanted the brothers to return to this very Gentile mindset, where he's more concerned about his competition with white men or equality with white men than he is about holding to his sisters. And of course you see in the 50s and 60s and 70s, all the way up until even 2010, a lot of the brothers going with white women and preferring them to their own women. We even have Diane Carroll recounting how Sidney Poitier had a white wife and she was married. And he wanted her to divorce her husband to become his mistress while he stayed with his white wife. That's how bad it got. And it even got so bad as having black men having this expectation that black women should defend them if they were accused of being raped by a white woman they were trying to date, or if they were lynched, by white men for trying to date a white woman. Not a fake rape or a fake pretending to date, but if they were caught with a white woman and then accused of rape, or if they were trying to date a white woman, they would expect black women to defend their right to date and have sex with white women. That's how bad it got. And it's still bad like that today. And of course, it's Jim Brown who's one of the people who's saying it's okay to get with white women. They're revolutionary also. And of course, then we see O.J. Simpson go from the black married family to marrying into Nicole Brown Simpson. And there were black women on that jury. And there were a lot of women who had resented what had happened, what was going on at the time. And this is in the 90s, even after the 70s and 80s, with a lot of black men dating and marrying white women. And so I believe, having listened to one of the women on the jury, I believe it had an influence on him not getting convicted. But one of the ways that we were seeing the economics being drained out of the black community from that was all of these very wealthy black properties in Martha's Vineyard. As these men began to divorce these women were being given the properties. White women were then being given the properties, these very elite properties from black elite families, generations of them who had owned these very expensive properties in Martha's Vineyard. And there was quite a lot of resentment about that. Of course, with athletes like Tiger Woods, or even musicians like Michael Jackson is doing this artificial insemination for children. Obviously, none of these children are him. They don't even look like him. But ultimately, these women or their children get their inheritance. And then one of the consequences of there being fewer partners for black women, and of course sexual trauma, the feminist movement really capitalized on trying to separate black women from black men because of this resentment. And to the black women feminists like Alice Walker, through movies like The Color Purple, were steering black women towards lesbianism, which homosexuality, it has been known in the past, is almost always a result of sexual trauma, but not according to scientism, I call it. But Celie's character has been raped and traumatized and beaten since she was a child, and so this polyamorous relationship is presented as the new evolved option for black women's sexuality. And of course, Alice Walker is bisexual, and so this enables the culture to transition into a lesbian feminist perspective, or if you're at all wanting to speak up about injury by the brothers or in a black patriarchal context. Because of black women being silenced about speaking out against any injury or oppression by black men, because then they were then termed as being betrayers of their men, that hostility or any sort of sexual injury in the past was transferred over to lesbianism and promoting feminists like Audre Lorde, who were hardcore lesbian feminists. And then, of course, The Color Purple promotes this loving relationship between these two women as a response to the violence, the sexual and physical violence that Celie is experiencing from her husband. So, but in addition, black men were up against very similar things. And I actually met Mario Van Peebles when he made the movie Badass. And he really recounts in that movie how his father, during the blaxploitation film era, in which many black women were exploited by their own brothers and presented as whores. Also, he was exploited as a young black male. He was forced into this role of actually having sex with an older black woman on camera, which I believe really traumatized him. And he talks about that in the movie, that it did traumatize him. Years later, he is then the director and producer of Empire, which is discussing these gender fluidity subjects among these black male rappers, the guys in the family. There's a really heavy promotion of, this matriarchy in the film as a woman running everything. And of course, we have this loudmouth actress playing the matriarch of the family, and quote unquote. And then we have, homosexuality explored as liberty amongst the male characters, and something that the Black community is not allowing. But given this history, and I just want to show you as the last note here, again, the sexual exploitation of Black male children, even white male and female children, in this movie with Shirley Temple called Baby Burlesque. And here, Black boys, children, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are being exploited sexually. And so we can see where the root of a lot of this stuff is coming, in particular.
A Weary Nipple Cafe Specials billboard tanks up at the Last Chance filling station by sucking on the end of a gas pump. The mouthfuls he swallows are conveniently monitored on the gulp meter standing nearby. In case you missed it, here's a longer close-up of the pump's nozzle by the tap-dancing African-American boy who performs a slow striptease down to his underwear.
I connect this back to Badass again, where it's Mario Van Peebles as a child is forced to play this role of young man breeder in order to prove his sexuality. Ironically, the complaint of Melvin Van Peebles is that all these gay men in Hollywood want him to sleep with them in exchange for making his movies. And what does he end up doing? He ends up exploiting his own son. Now, Mario Van Peebles has forgiven his father for that and loves him and honors him like a good eldest son. But I believe that it's affected him and the community in more subtle ways. And I think this is what is precisely probably what is happening for young men coming out of prison or out of the hood and into this Hebrew identity. Their sexuality, the issues of their sexuality haven't been dealt with yet. And so we have this confusion, this violence towards women, or pedophilia in these camps, and multiplying of wives, and all of these perversions that are outside of the scripture. So these are the things that we can look to begin to unpick these issues within the community, and these are the ways in which we can stand up for ourselves in order to talk about this kind of subject matter. There was an interesting movie called Something New also that came out that really showed, was pushing Black women towards white men, because there was a kind of a thing in the 80s, 90s, and up where Black men would be very sort of metrosexual and very picky about Black women having beautiful clothes, having their hair done, their nails done. This is where the pressure to relax and straighten their hair came from, not only from the white community disliking the natural hair and what it symbolized, but it was actually coming from Black men for a lot of Black women. And then there was a constant comparison to white women. White women are more feminine, white women are nicer, kinder, all of this disregarding the pressures on Black women to support the family, to be the big mama, to be the center of the family, to earn a living for themselves, to not have a variety of partners. All the ways, all of the desires of Black women were being, to be a wife, to be a mother, all of those things were being basically taken away. The opportunities or options, the marriage rate of Black women from the 70s, 80s onwards was way lower from when there was segregation, because so many Black men were going with white women and then comparing their beauty to that of white women. So now white women were getting it from Black women, white women, they were getting it from white men, and they were getting it from Black men, saying that you are not beautiful, so you are not female, you are not feminine. Unless you have straight, long hair and you wear nice clothes like all the white women do, because they have money and they have husbands and they have fathers who look after them. Unless you, in order to be feminine, that's how you have to look. You have to have beautiful, long, flowing, straight hair. Because you would run into these brothers, these pretty boys like that Blair and Underwood would often play in movies, where what the brothers would do is, because of the shift in roles, is that they would try to outdo sisters in femininity and beauty and grooming. So you'd get these very what you might call today metrosexual, effeminized men who would be checking if your nails were done and how your hair was, and if you had a pimple, he'd point it out on your face, and just trying to, what they would call, beat you with a soft sock, knock you down a little bit, and it extended out of a pimp mentality. And so I would just be like, I would not have it. Not in any way, shape, or form. And so there are these patriarchal tactics that African American men took on to cause women to be submitted, and that's including the whole thing of there is no prohibition in Scripture of not wearing makeup. Now you don't want to walk in deception. You want to be as honest and plain as you can be, but what you find in the camps is this emphasis on these kinds of things, which is so out of order. And this is a way of controlling and constraining the woman to prove your masculinity. And what this comes from is a white, male, Gentile perspective on women. Because throughout their culture, they make it very clear that they don't like their women. Whereas that was not the position that black men held. That the Hebrew men held in Scripture. The woman is honored. The Proverbs 31 woman is a pretty miraculous woman. I still haven't attained that level yet. I think my sister is like that. But that is your typical African woman, and they were very much respected in the Scripture you see. But the white male Gentile gaze or framing of the Scripture and the roles of black men and women, you can see how much it has contaminated the minds of black men and women. So where women are like, I don't need a man and I can survive on my own. But again, I say this about the brothers who are coming out of captivity, really, and coming into the truth. It's best to just, whatever is going on with you, to set yourself apart. And to learn to trust, the voice, the Ruach Kodesh. It's better to do that than to sort of undo a lot of this programming and conditioning in the Ruach and with your brothers and sisters, rather than to run into marriage and cults and these groups and stuff that just really sort of ruin the work that the Ruach is trying to do with external practices rather than renewing the inner man. And even in the Apocrypha in Wisdom of Solomon, it's mentioned that there are gay men coming out of Egypt, out in the Exodus. So it's given all this terrible history, it's bound to happen again. So it just has to be dealt with as it comes rather than enforcing all these external pressures on people. I don't mean that, people should be practicing these things, but that they should be trying to work out their salvation with Yah without being pressured into marriage and multiplying wives and all this kind of thing. On a final note, ultimately, Yahshua will be the he-goat before the flocks, but men, cannot neglect the protecting of the women. But of course, Yah is the strong defender of Israel. And again, I want to say that because of everything that has happened to the people, it's very important to be very open about how this is possibly affected the community. And so I think, the 400 years or the 40 years in the desert, it's all akin to the 40 days of purification and setting apart of the woman after she has the male child, and the 40 days that took place before Adam was placed in the garden in the promised land. So setting oneself apart, preparing oneself in this wilderness is probably the wisest thing to do given all the controversy within the camps. And I really think a lot of the stuff going on in the camps originally was paid agent planted type stuff. But now true Israel is waking up. And so these are things that you arrive at prayerfully with Yah. But I hope everybody can demonstrate sensitivity to the things that have happened to so many of the people in the family of Yah, so that we can all make it through together. May Yah bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine on you. May he be gracious, lift the light of his countenance, and give you peace. Shalom, family.